And it was then that I was like connecting the dots, like, oh, so you don't just like write poetry and it gets published and we have to study it in school. It's a career. And that's when it finally like, oh, this is interesting. This is really interesting.
Welcome to Broadcastability, a podcast by, for, and about people with disabilities and about inclusive workplaces. It's part of the PROUD project at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. You can find out more about the PROUD project on our website, www.theproudproject.ca.
The PROUD project is based at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, which is on the traditional ancestral territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Isabelle Avakumovic-Pointon works on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We would also like to acknowledge the other Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, where we conduct our research and record this podcast.
Hi, I'm Dr. Chloë Atkins, and I'm the lead investigator of the PROUD project. I'm a political scientist, actually a political and legal theorist, at the University of Toronto, where I do work in health equity, anti-ableism, bioethics, and human rights. As a person with an episodic disability, I also have lived experience with employment and disability.
My name is Isabelle Avakumovic-Pointon, and I'm a research assistant for the PROUD project. I'm also a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, where I research disability history. I identify as a person with invisible disabilities.
Maybe we should, as an intro, I'll say this, is that if you're hearing background noises, is because I'm using oxygen today and it makes a bit of noise in the background. So hopefully it's temporary.
So this episode, we're talking with Matilda Feyisayo Ibini, who is a playwright from London. And they're one of the few artists we've spoken to, both in the research interviews and, right, of course, on Broadcastability. So it's been really interesting hearing their experiences, their life and their education. Their interview is actually so long and rich that we decided to divide this into 2 episodes. So there's Matilda Part 1, and then next time will be Matilda Part 2. In this episode, we're focusing on their life and their experiences, their career. And then in Part 2, we'll talk about their views of, disability representation, employment, the sort of bigger picture things, though of course that comes up in this part as well.
So one of the things I find really poignant about when I listen to Matilda, she's so articulate, and she's sitting at the center of one of the world's financial and cultural centers, like where people do a lot of speak from. Like there's a force to where she is. She's at a locus or a focus point, but she's also experienced in all sorts of marginal identities, things that have affected her. The fact that she's a child of an immigrant, the child of a single mom who was a very forceful character, to expect a lot from her kids, that she's Black, that she's queer, that she's disabled, that she's a woman. So in a sense, even the quality of her voice is very assured, and it comes out very clearly, but you're also aware of how much that voice has been derived from experiencing all those those identities. But she's also really fortunate in the sense that she's at the center there. She's in London, which is I hope helps magnify some of her voice and what she has to say.
As a historian, I'm really interested in Matilda's discussion of how family and cultural and religious attitudes shape their upbringing, and how, these intersecting identities, but also intersecting expectations and beliefs about what people should be able to do, what is normal to be able to do, but also how these can be adapted, and they can be restrictive or they can be empowering, depending on how we interpret things. I just want to add that, again, with this like family expectations, one thing that really struck me was the fact that Matilda's mom, as Matilda's disability changed over time, and the things that they could do changed over time, their mom was still like, you're going to do chores of some kind. Like we will find a way for you to do some sort of contribution to the household, which I think is a really excellent example of how, yes, disabled people do things differently and can't do certain things, but there are still many different ways to contribute to community.
You make an amazing point. I think that's really, she was raised in an environment in which she was expected to be part of that community, regardless of how she felt physically and how she functioned physically, and that the resource of her mind was a very capable resource. So even if she couldn't move around that well, then she was expected to use her mind to help facilitate the family's functioning. And I think that you make a really good point about that, and I think that gets carried forward into the rest of her life.
Firstly, thank you for having me. My name is Matilda Feyisayo Ibini, and I am a Nigerian-British writer based in London. I have a condition called limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. I'm a full-time wheelchair user. I'm supported by a team, a great team of carers and PAs that support me with my everyday living, everything from personal care to also supporting me in my work. I'm a freelance playwright, screenwriter, and aspiring filmmaker, but I'm getting there. I grew up in a very Nigerian home in East London. I have 3 other siblings, so an older sister, younger brother. So I'm the second oldest. I'm the only person in my family with limb girdle. And yeah, that's about a quick summary. Yeah.
Well, that's great. One of the things I hope people will enjoy is that you're one of the few artists we'll talk to, people who work in the art and entertainment industry, and I think it's your perspective is incredibly valuable. So,
thank you.
You come from an immigrant family. You were born in the UK, but you come from an immigrant family. You're also of color, and so I think there's. I'd love to know what that experience, that sort of cross-sectional identity of being a woman, someone who's a child of a parent who immigrated from Nigeria, as well as being Black. I mean, and disabled. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
And I'd also add queer too.
I'm queer as well. Yeah, cool.
Easy question to get started with,
I'd say there were aspects of my childhood that were pleasant, but my childhood is also littered with a lot of trauma. I think growing up, not even just in a Nigerian household, but also a very Christian household. I no longer identify as a Christian. I'm not practicing Christian, but I'd say a lot of the kind of early ableism and even some of the internalized ableism that I'd internalized growing up stemmed from a lot of kind of Christian values mixed in with Nigerian culture of what disability was or what it represented in the terms of often negative connotations, in the sense of, the Christian belief that we're all born in sin, and that if you repent enough, you will eventually be healed. And then even in particularly, let's say the Nigerian culture, having a child with a disability is often seen as the punishment from maybe like it's the punishment of the parents, or the parents are being punished, or your ancestors, one of your ancestors did something wrong and they've not atoned, and therefore your descendants are disabled or have you, or that it's a bad omen, or that it's an evil spirit and things like that. And a lot of that, as you can imagine, as a child, was incredibly damaging to listen to and hear and be surrounded by on a daily basis. And if it wasn't for people changing their minds or being open to like understanding that disability is just a part of life, it's a part of it's another way of just existing, I think I probably wouldn't be in the career that I'm in, and I wouldn't be living the way that I'm living now, basically. And a ton of therapy to unpack all of that. And to be honest, there's still so much I'm still unpacking. But I'd say it also meant just having a different there are other parts of Nigerian culture that also does embrace disability. And that was really exciting to discover later on in life, that actually the narratives I was taught or brought up to believe are not the only narratives out there. Yeah, as a quick summary. But I'd also add that oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I'd also add that because I also had 3 non-disabled siblings, what I found difficult was not realizing I wasn't like them, in a way that like I couldn't keep up with them. I couldn't play in the same way that they did, or what have you. And so I'd often measure myself to their abilities, and that would also kind of can I swear? Make me feel shit, like that I couldn't keep up with my own siblings. Yeah.
And especially when you're the second eldest, right? When you're meant to, in a sense, be the paradigm they're meant to be following. And if
exactly having my younger siblings support me.
That's really interesting context to be growing up in, because we, as you may remember, were really interested in sort of family of origin and childhood, and how, you know, the way your early childhood context affects your expectations for future work and practicalities. So could you just maybe briefly walk us through what it was like? You mentioned a bit kind of growing up with your condition that wasn't really well understood, and how that sort of impacted your early life trajectory.
Yeah. So for a long time in the beginning, I'd say when the first symptoms started presenting themselves, because doctors didn't have the technology back then and couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, I was often accused of faking it for attention. And I remember I think I wrote about it in one of my plays, many instances when if my mum wasn't present in the room and I was left with the doctors, I'd essentially just get a telling off that you need to stop doing this, and you need to walk properly and move properly, or this isn't good, you don't want to be like this forever, kind of thing. And so for a long time I started doubting myself, that is this real, that if I just worked hard enough or paid more attention when I was walking, then I would just walk the way that my siblings walk, or what have you. Or that if I remember, though I have a complicated relationship with physiotherapy, and I remember doing it like religiously, and my mum checking that I'm doing my exercises or making me do them in front of her, whatever, and then going to an appointment, and because there was no change or improvement, being accused of not doing them, that, oh, we should have seen a change by now, we should have seen a difference if you've been doing them every day. And I had, but I wasn't believed. And so for a long time I was constantly second guessing that, is this real? Is this something of my own doing?
Right.
And it wasn't until essentially until diagnosis, which was, so symptoms started age 5 and I wasn't diagnosed till age 13. So throughout those about a good 8 years of just tests until they think they find something, and essentially until I was believed. And that was after having a muscle biopsy where they were like, oh yeah, her muscles don't work, there's something missing here.
Well, it's I mean, I had a similar experience, and so I totally relate. And I think one of the things that becomes apparent is you're not only carrying the burden of not functioning in the same manner and being excluded for that, but then you're being, in a sense, psychiatrized. You are then you're then getting a secondary label of somehow you are not as trustworthy psychologically. And to have that as a youngster, when you're developing your sense of self, it is an extra, it's something to carry, but also it gets weaponized against you sort of developing normally.
Absolutely. And I think back then at least, one of my coping strategies was to literally throw myself into Christianity. So I would pray, I would fast, I would attend the special prayers, I would do everything possible that, okay, if I can appease God, he could take this away tomorrow. I could wake up and jump out of bed. And I think for a long while at that age, before at least the ages of 16, I truly believed I could just be cured like that tomorrow, because Christianity plays, and not just maybe Christianity, but religion plays such a huge part of Nigerian culture, like spirituality generally. And so for me, I think I tried to make sense of it, that okay, if the doctors are saying that they can't find anything and that there's nothing wrong, then it is about my relationship with God, and I need to fix that so he trusts me enough to heal me, kind of thing. And I think back and I'm laughing because I think back just because I didn't have anything else. Like I didn't have any relationships or connections to other disabled people. I didn't meet other disabled children. So I held on to whatever I could hold on to. And at that time, it was Christianity.
What it makes me think about is we're interested in that as you merge into your mid-teens and then your later teens, you're then started thinking of career. And if one of the things we met previously in a previous interview, one of the things you talked about was how, in a sense, your family wasn't connected with a lot of the social services that you might have been connected with had you maybe been properly diagnosed. And I also suspect maybe if you had been a different family in a different place, you might have had more access.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of interested if you could talk about how that impacted, what were people saying you were going to do for your life? Were they just sort of, was it a dark picture? What were your expectations given all that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger, so I've always had a very vivid imagination, and for a long time I thought I was going to be an astronaut. At one point I thought I was going to be a doctor so I could just cure myself. And then I really got into baking for a little bit, and I was like, oh, I could be a baker. I could open up my own shop one day. So writing was never on the table. Though I'd always wrote stories just for myself, I never connected that it was a career. And so for a long time in secondary school, I won't lie, a lot of teachers were like, I wasn't going to amount to anything. I had a teacher say that to my face. And I didn't know what that meant at that age. But when I'm older, I realized that's not something you should never tell a child, let alone another person. But my mum, who I would describe as a pusher parent, and I'm kind of grateful for that, though when I was younger, I just often thought she was just pushing me away. But as a pusher parent, it meant she didn't expect anything less than what my siblings were capable of. So like my older sister went to uni, so I was going to uni. Had no idea what I was going to study, but I knew that I'm going because my older sister went. And then my older sister got a job, and then there was just an expectation, yeah, you're going to get a job. So my mum was very much of the mindset, and I think it took a while. She wasn't like this from the beginning, but I think it took a while. Once we got on the diagnosis, she too had to grieve and realize that this isn't something that's going to go away tomorrow. And though to this day she'll still send me prayers and things like that, she is very much aware that we have to make the most of whatever mobility I have at any given time. And so she adapted in a way that was really enabling. So there was the kind of talks of, yes, what are you going to do at uni? And like any Nigerian parent, they want doctors, they want lawyers, they want engineers. And at that time, I thought I was going to study a psychology degree. But instead, I ended up changing it to creative writing and English literature behind her back, and then told her like a term in that I'm not studying psychology. But like she's always been a pusher parent and has just been like, okay, so when I physically couldn't hoover anymore, okay, I do dusting. When I couldn't do dusting anymore, I fold laundry. So she'd always find a way of me partaking, even if it's not exactly as like my siblings or to the full extent of something. She was like, there's always a way, we can do this instead, you'll do this instead. And so from home, so you can imagine I was getting two different voices. There's a voice from school saying like, don't think about that, that's not for you, you're not gonna go anywhere or go anywhere far. And then home, I'm like, so have a think about what you would like to do, what you would like to study. Even when, yes, she was admittedly upset that I'd changed my degree without telling her, but when I finished the degree, she was like, so wait, how are you going to get a job? What have you been looking for jobs? Are you thinking, what are you thinking about? What do you think you can do? And it was her and my older sister that encouraged me a job came up at a charity that I used to volunteer at from like age 16, and they both encouraged me to apply, and I applied and I got the job. And though the job as good as it was a part-time job, so it's flexible enough to work around my condition. It was also actually at the UK charity of muscular dystrophy. So they used to be called the Muscular Dystrophy Campaign, and I think they're called now Muscular Dystrophy UK. So I used to work in their campaigns team that was specifically aimed at young disabled people. So I got to do all this learning about how big the inequality exists between non-disabled young people and disabled young people, and all the campaigns that they did around trying to get better and more reliable and accessible public transport, trying to make city centres around like the shopping malls more accessible, trying to make university a more accessible experience. All of that kind of really compounded some of the like pushing that my mum did, that you are part of this world and you need to actively take up space and be a part of the world. But that didn't come.
I love the way you said that. That being a part of the world, because I think for many people don't see people with disabilities, or you don't like that term, disabled, but we're going to talk about that, but disabled people as being integral parts of the community, right?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. The thing about your mom finding a different chore for you to do every time, I'm like, that's the one constant in childhood, is you're always going to have to do chores. But I think that's really interesting, is like, it's a great example of how, you know, disabled people are contributing to, always are. There's always something that
even when it
do.
got to the point of like, okay, you're going to write the shopping list, so you need to go around the kitchen and see what we're low on. Like, there was always a job for me to do. I was never like allowed to just like sit out and just be like, oh, but my legs are tired. Oh,
No,
I don't
never
that. You know, it's like, no, your siblings are doing their chores, so here's your chores.
Yeah, but I think that's a great way of sort of showing that, you know, everyone is contributing in different ways. And I also wondered, because you said you never, like, you wanted to be like an astronaut and everything, but you never really considered like writing, that you love to do, as something that could be a career. And I remember in the first interview you had a really funny story about Shakespeare. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you started to realize that this writing that you did for fun for yourself could actually become a career.
So I used to write, now that we have a word for it, so I used to write a lot of Scooby-Doo fan fiction, and I just literally replaced the main characters with myself and my friends, and we'd go on all these adventures. It wasn't until secondary school, actually, when I think we started doing poetry, and not just reading poetry, but getting assignments to write poetry, where it just kind of opened up my imagination even more, in terms of being able to talk about things without having to literally say them. I found that incredibly compelling, that it almost felt like writing in poetry was like writing in code, that I could express these complex feelings, or this pain, or this frustration, or what I was going through that I often couldn't verbally express, in poetry. And encouraged by my secondary school teacher, Mrs. Gallagher, she was like, keep going. I think, you know, you could do this as a career one day. And I was like, okay. I had no idea what that meant. And I remember, was it myself or someone else in class? I might have said that it was me, but it could have been someone else in class, when everyone thought Shakespeare was alive. I was like, why are we studying this? This is so old. We don't understand what he's saying. And it wasn't until, like, for example, we read Romeo and Juliet, the play script, in class, and was analyzing it, had no idea what this story was about. I was like, someone loves someone, until we watched the Baz Luhrmann film. And I was like, is that what the play is about? Oh my God, that is amazing. Like, it was just like, oh, because the text just alone can read really cold, and also can make you not feel smart enough to understand it. So it was until you could see the words in motion in a physical form that I was able to understand the story. And again, making that link of that Shakespeare was paid to write those. He didn't just write them because they were fun or for himself, or he could have, but he was paid to. And I was like, what? That's a career? And it's like, and when the same English teacher, when she was like, yeah, think of all the books you've ever read. So Mallory Blackman's a huge Black British writer who's predominantly writes for young people and children, and like people of my generation would have most likely discovered her at school or in your local library. And it's like, yeah, how do you think Mallory Blackman is a writer? She gets paid to do that. That's why she writes books. And it was then that was like connecting the dots, like, oh, so you don't just like write poetry and it gets published and we have to study it in school. It's a career. And that's when it finally like, oh, this is interesting. This is really interesting. And I think it was when I was taken to, so we used to go see a lot of pantomime, whether they came and did performances in school or we went to the theatre. And pantomime wasn't really my vibe. Like I got it, it's very, you know, glittery and funny and campy, but it wasn't quite my tastes until we went to see a play at Soho Theatre, and I must have been about 15 at the time. And this was probably the first play that maybe wasn't necessarily aimed at young people, but our drama teacher took us to go see it, and I watched it, and I watched the show, but I was also watching the audience because I was just in awe at everyone's reactions to the show. I was like, how is he doing this? How is this writer doing this? And again, being reminded that he was paid by the theatre to write this, and people bought tickets to come see the show. And I was like, oh my God, I think this is what I want to be doing. I want people coming to see stories, and I want to see them laugh, and I want to see them gasp, and I want to see them not be able to sit still in their seats whilst receiving this story. And the stories can be about anything, like this particular play that we saw was about race and identity and the politics in football. And I was like, whoa, it was about so many different things, but it was only like an hour and a half. And it was about this young man who'd come from, and I can't remember which African country, but he'd come from Africa to play football on a UK team and gets caught up in a scandal. And I was like, how he was able to talk about all these other things whilst telling this singular narrative. I was like, that really, like, that was the first stepping stone that I needed to know that stories are useful. Stories are useful, and they're needed, and they need storytellers to tell them.
Go ahead, Isabelle. Go.
That's such an eloquent way of like, you can tell that you're a writer, because now I'm gonna go to the theater. Like, I really want to go to the theater now. That's such an excellent way of describing it, and that's such a cool moment. We were like, wait, Shakespeare was paid. But yeah, it's not something they don't really talk about the economics of theater, but it's really important because people got to pay bills. But that's such an interesting way that you found out. So that was in high school that this was happening, and so that sort of pushed you to do English literature.
Exactly. So I did English literature in college, and college is just about 2 years before you start university.
Okay.
And so I'd also was doing English literature and psychology. So I think there was still the belief that I was going to study psychology because that's what my mum wanted me to do, and you never want to disappoint your parents. So then,
right.
But I think when I was going through the course lists of all the courses that the university did, as well as the psychology, that's when I stumbled across creative writing and English literature and all the different like approaches to storytelling that you get to try. So you get to try like not just poetry, not just writing essays, but also writing short stories, writing graphic novels, writing for video games, writing for theatre, writing for film and TV, for radio. And I was like, oh my God, this is for me. But how am I going to convince my mum this is what I actually want to be doing?
So as you're talking, one of the things I realized, I mean, I don't know whether you've done this. I suspect you have. There's many times when you have an illness like ours, I mean, where ours are different, but that you spend a lot of time by yourself and maybe in a bed or in... And there's people milling about, they're traveling, they're doing stuff, and yet you at some level are in a state in which you're not moving around much and maybe not seeing as many people. And actually, I wouldn't mind you talking about this, whether you've experienced this, but for me, what it did for me was, in a sense, drew me inward to have a more active thinking and maybe even fantasy life, a life in which, in order, in a sense, to stay sane, I knew that I had to be sort of be for myself, like find things, and the technologies we have are great. Like the fact that this was years ago, took up the internet with the old modems, and no one ever could get me because I was just always like exploring. But just, can you tell me a little bit about how your disability might in fact be an asset for you, or maybe it isn't an asset,
Yeah.
but.
No, absolutely. I'd almost say as a kind of positive byproduct of it. Was my imagination. That the reality is I've somehow found a way to monetize something that started off as a hobby, which was writing stories for myself, like those Scooby-Doo fan fictions and even the poems. Other than the assignments, I wasn't sharing that with anyone. For me, I wasn't yet comfortable in a place where I wanted anyone to read those narratives. They were almost like a creative way of journaling without having to actually say what you feel and what's going on and what's upsetting you. So instead of like writing down an event, I tell a story instead. And absolutely, because gradually I started to become very stationary, that I couldn't keep up with my siblings. They were often, going on school trips that often sometimes even meant overnight stays, trips and things that I couldn't go on. In order to console myself, I'd turn to stories, to reading. I got really into comics. I'd spend summers in the library because I really couldn't go out and play with everyone because I often couldn't keep up. But my mum didn't like the idea of me just cooped up in my room. So she's like, go to the library then. You can go, there's endless books. You'll read something. You can prepare for the following year of school. Absolutely. And my current counselor believes that my incredibly wild imagination was probably forged because I was physically losing the ability to move. So my brain often moves very quickly in both good and not so good ways. But absolutely, that my imagination essentially created as a child a refuge for myself in a world where I couldn't be understood or was constantly being accused of faking. I was able to create my own kind of imaginary sanctuaries where I could just be and go on my own adventures and have the friends that I didn't have necessarily in secondary school or didn't have in college or uni. Because I think I forgot to mention I was like horrifically bullied throughout secondary school and and also college. So that was like from the ages of 11 to 18. And that had a detrimental effect on my mental health when from 18 onwards, and one that I'm still kind of reckoning with today. But my imagination is both a huge blessing, but can also be turned against me quite quickly because of kind of internalized ableism, internalized anti-Blackness, internalized homophobia, like all of that stuff.
I'm just gonna hop in the narrative now. This is a non-linear structure we're going for, just because that's really fascinating. But now I want to hop back to you're after uni, after you did your degree, your mom and sister convinced you to apply for a job with Muscular Dystrophy UK. And what was that experience like?
So I only ended up staying a year there, and I was a campaigns assistant working on all sorts of projects and campaigns, with the hope of having not just real world, but legislative change as well. And there was some real great progress that was made on some of those campaigns in terms of getting it into press, even kind of interviews on at prime slots on news channels about the inequality young disabled people were facing and still are facing in the UK. But the thing that I guess I wasn't warned about was the working at a charity that is also about your condition. So for every kind of success that they had, the government would announce a new scheme, a new a proposal that they're looking at pushing into law or whatever that would undo the months of work or even years of work that preceded my tenure at that role, that would just undo all those campaigning, all that hard work. And it was also, I think, aggravating at the time, which I don't think had I been diagnosed yet? Yes, no, I think I had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety by then, but it was also triggering a lot of those feelings working at that place. And it's nothing to do with the people that works there. It's just the content of what we're working on. We're working on trying to make the world a better place for disabled people, and the government keeps saying fuck you or finding new ways to fuck us over. And I just, mentally I couldn't keep up with that. It was just this kind of weird cycle that you get into of like hope and then it's dashed again, and then hope, then rebuilding that hope and then having it dashed again. And I was like, maybe I don't need to know all of this is happening in a way in order for me to be able to move on and hold on to my mental health. I don't think I should know like this much in terms of, for some conditions, I think mine included, that we're nowhere near treatments. Like, yes, we're calling up people and emailing people for donations, but for conditions like mine, we're nowhere near treatments. What they're currently focusing on is shortening the diagnosis time. Like, let's bring that 8 years down to like a year or two. It's too long to be leaving people without knowing what they have. And I was like, I don't really need to know this. I won't be, I met other people that had the other types of muscular dystrophy through that job. And all of us acknowledge that none of us will be alive by the time they find any kind of treatment. Like, it won't be in our lifetime. We won't benefit from it. And so it kind of felt like the job was like a constant reminder of that. And I just really didn't need that. I needed something that enabled me to just keep moving forward, that actually let me get to the next age.
To live the life that you have. Right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there is always this focus on, medicine will advance. And I have much the same feeling, which is, it could advance or it could not, but you need to live now. Like, you need to.
Exactly. Right? And so it was on the advice of one of the friends that I'd met through the job, who was like, what would you rather be doing? And I was like, really and truly writing, but I have no idea how you make money. Like, I did an entire degree for 3 years, and the thing they forgot to mention was, like, this is, you're not meant to be doing it for free. How do you actually make this a job? He advised, look at like some of your favorite writers, like just have a read of their journeys if they're on Wikipedia or whatever. And I did, and I noticed a lot of them had done some kind of postgraduate degree in writing for performance. And just the initial Googling that I did about, a degree, another. And also, I didn't have the best time at uni. Not necessarily my course was great, and the friends and lecturers that I had were brilliant. It was actually the uni itself, and getting support I needed put in place was incredibly slow, impacted my mental health. And actually, that's what made me get the depression and anxiety diagnosis going to university. So that should tell you all about the experience. But it wasn't.
It shows you. Well, just as you're talking, look, anybody who's confronted by some of the issues you faced, if you didn't have depression and anxiety, I think you wouldn't be human at some level. Like, it's interesting. We talk about people, the whole things about terminology, people with disabilities, disabled people, and I'm intrigued by the French concept of personne en situation du handicap, which is a person in a disabling context, which just sort of shows that there are things around you that actually make it worse. It's like you and yourself are fine, but it's how you interact with all these other things that actually can, in a sense, create, because you're human, your response to these barriers, these difficulties, the bullying, whatever it is, or the rigidity of systems can create actually the issues rather than.
Yeah, right. That one of the things that when I got my first wheelchair, so I didn't get a wheelchair till I was 22. And one of the things I remember being told by them, maybe the occupational therapist at the time, was like, you needed a wheelchair when you were like 13, 14, even if it was a part-time one, I needed a wheelchair much sooner. And the consequence of not having a wheelchair much sooner is that now as an adult, I have arthritis in my ankles, but it's so far progressed that someone my age shouldn't have such extreme progression of arthritis, but it's most likely because I was walking on my legs longer than I should have. That actually, had I had breaks of having, if I was a part-time wheelchair user as a teenager, where there were days where I can walk and other days where I used a wheelchair, maybe my arthritis wouldn't be so as progressed as it has now. And it's like, but in order to do that, it would have meant not going to the school that I went to, because I didn't go to a school that was accessible. It's a school with lots of stairs, and I had to climb every single step. There was no other way of getting around. So it was a school that was incredibly like mainstream, inaccessible, and it was a Catholic school. So we had the extra layer of judgment because God and Jesus is everywhere. And it meant now I'm paying the price as an adult for support I didn't receive when I was younger, that I should have gotten, in terms of being able to look after the wear and tear in my joints. But everyone, I remember the advice that I was getting from everyone in terms of physios, occupational therapists, and doctors was keep walking, keep walking, keep walking. You have to keep walking. The moment you stop, the moment you lose it, it's not going to come back. Keep walking, keep walking. And actually, it should have been walk sometimes, rest other times,
Yeah, that reminds me of, sorry, are you?
Yeah,
that reminds me of a term I encountered, and I can't remember who it comes from, but the idea of curative violence, of the extra damage done to disabled bodies in attempts to cure them, where that by trying to, cure you of something that is just not curable, big scare quotes, that they actually end up doing more damage to your body. And I just think that's such a messed up cycle.
And mental health.
Oh yeah. Which is of course intimately connected with embodied experience. So that's just an interesting one. And was it just because of your school that you didn't have a wheelchair, or was there other barriers?
Most schools in my area were not wheelchair accessible. And I couldn't even tell you if they were today, is the thing as well.
Right.
Not much has probably changed. So most schools weren't accessible. And I think the one school that I was aware of that had a lot of young disabled people with maybe learning disabilities and things like that didn't necessarily cater to someone whose condition only affects them physically. So I would have also been in an environment that also kind of wasn't necessarily meeting my needs, because their what's the word, at least at that time, it was mainly we accept students with learning difficulties or differences.
I mean, even if you'd had a wheelchair, like they could have planned your classes, especially in maybe secondary school, so that they were on one level, or even if you'd had wheelchair available on that level, that were a lot of classes where that you could at least sit and use that.
So they tried something like that so there was an upper school and a lower school. So in the lower school, worse access, just not possible. In the upper school, they tried putting my classes on one level, but the teachers whose classrooms we'd occupied would get upset that, if you're having you can't have science on the English floor, or you can't have this subject on this floor. Like, that's their classroom. We don't want to have to give up our classroom just because one student is disabled. So there was a lot of like politics around classrooms, and like, no, we're not in that room this week. She doesn't want us to be in her room. We're actually on the 3rd floor. And I'd be like, oh, great.
Yeah, no, I encountered much the same thing. It is, and to be honest, I think it's good you say it, because I think people forget how traumatic that can be. And and it's traumatic psychologically because you're hoping it's a simple solution, but in fact people resist it because they're of their own actually mental proclivities. Maybe they're anxious and they don't feel comfortable. I mean, there are all sorts of things that have to be navigated. And if it's not openly talked about, then it's not well managed. But just so you know, I have terrible arthritis as a result of the same thing, and so I've had joint replacements. And so these are things that result.
I want to hop back to your master's, because that seems like a very, I know we're kind of, non-linear, as we said. But that seems like a really sort of pivotal moment. So how were you able to choose your program, pay for it? If you want to talk about that, you don't have to.
Absolutely. It was a huge, pivotal moment. And it's also what compelled me to leave the muscular dystrophy job. So it was not long after that friend had advised, look at other writers' careers, see how they got into making it a profession. That's when I noticed a lot of them had done masters. So I'd searched up all the masters in London because I knew I wouldn't be able to go outside of London. I also did my undergraduate in London as well. So it felt not that dissimilar from school, because I would go to university, then come home, because I didn't have the support. My mum was still somewhat a carer at the time for me. So there was no way I could have lived in another city and not get the same support, or I didn't know how that worked. I only discovered after, in my master's, I only discovered in working at the muscular dystrophy charity that it would have been possible for me to study in another city and get a care package of that the city or the university or the local authority that I was based in would have funded carers and PAs to support me whilst at uni. However, I didn't know that at the time. So I ended up going to university in London and just going home at the end of the day. And so that was the same thing for when I did my master's. I did it in London because all my support is here. And by this time, actually, what was different was that I'd moved out. So I'm jumping all over the place. I'd moved out of the family home not long after I'd graduated and just before I started the muscular dystrophy job. I had a very helpful physiotherapist who went above and beyond their role in showing me how to apply for housing, because she could see that the family home that I was living in, that I'd lived in most of my childhood, wasn't meeting my needs and was also putting me in danger, and I wasn't able to have a wheelchair because of the house that we lived in. It's an old Victorian house. The walls are too weak to put a stair lift in, so I had to be moved out. And because I was over 18, I would have been 21 at this time, the local authority said, we can move you out, but just you, not your family. So I was also embarking on living on my own for the first time. So when I did my master's, it's almost like I got a slight uni experience, because I was still living in London, I was now living on my own and studying. So I had left my the muscular dystrophy job because I couldn't work and study, went back onto benefits. The way I was able to even do the master's is because I got a scholarship from BAFTA and Warner Brothers. Had I not gotten that scholarship, I would have not done a master's, and I would still be at the muscular dystrophy job. If all those things hadn't fallen into place, I would have kept my job and maybe found another way to get into writing a different way. But it meant then I now lived on my own, had the wheelchair that I finally needed after all those years. So I was 22 when I got my wheelchair. I was 22 when I started that the master's, and was now using my wheelchair at home, but I could also walk around my flat, and also using the wheelchair, more importantly, when I traveled to uni. And the university was wheelchair accessible, and I did get the support I needed from day one of uni. So I was now at uni with using a wheelchair to help me get about. I had a note taker in class that could also help me take notes, and would either type them up and email them to me, or just give me their written notes. I was also, because of the scholarship, it also essentially the scholarship opened a lot of doors for me. So it gave me mentors who are writers and working in in the industry, and I had access to all these masterclasses with makers of writers, filmmakers of different levels that I got introductions to, and it was through the scholarship that I got my first, my first proper paid opportunity through one of my mentors because of the scholarship. So that scholarship, was incredibly pivotal, and it's still running today, the BAFTA scholarships. So if anyone is ever interested, and based in the UK, but I also think they do it there's BAFTA scholarships in America, and more recently BAFTA scholarships somewhere in Asia, because I remember there was it's on the website that they've got lots of different they're operating in not just the UK, but to train people from low income backgrounds, or who've not had the opportunity to study in a field related to, I think, TV, film, or games, and they will pay your full tuition, which is amazing. And so that's kind of what enabled me to be able to, one, feel like I was being taken seriously, that this wasn't a hobby anymore, and two, that because I got my first job through the scholarship, through one of my mentors, it also led me to finding an agent, which is also what kickstarted more regular, frequent employment. So I've been writing now for just over a decade, and being paid to write for like just over half that time. The first half was writing whilst either when I was doing my master's, and so I wasn't able to get work during then because because I already had such limited energy, limited mobility. I can't do everything. I can't study part-time and work part-time. It's one or the other. So if I was studying, it meant I was living off benefits, and benefits are pennies, and it just meant living a very I don't even know how you describe it. Like, I think because I grew up poor, like I used to joke with my siblings that like, oh, it doesn't matter if I never make any money from writing because it's not any different from our current existence. And so living off benefits, yes, was a struggle, but I'd already had experience of having to live a very not financially kind of comfortable life. Like I'd already lived so many years where we don't turn on the heating when it is freezing. We don't, making sure lights are always switched off, making food stretch far longer than it should or whatever. Like we'd already grown up like that. So living off benefits and writing and not being paid, though not ideal, and I wouldn't recommend to anyone, I kind of made do until I started getting paid for it in a way. And it kind of it's kind of weird of like thinking that in some way I was a kind of starving artist, but the starvation wasn't new. Like I'd had a history of having to do that growing up anyway. If I'm being really frank, what got me through that was benefits, having a generous sister, an older sister who was working full time and things like that, who could lend me money to cover rent and things when I didn't have enough. And I know not everybody has that. And I'm very aware that in itself is a kind of privilege, but like, yeah, for a long time, it was just like benefits of my older sister lending me money. At times, it almost felt like you had to make a choice of, do I work or not? Because if I work, I risk this very precarious safety net of benefits. But if I don't work, I will never be able to save even for a holiday on benefits. Like, which one do I had to kind of make a choice of which one am I going to do? And because I had the, again, precarious safety net of a generous sister, I thought, fuck it, if everything blows up, I'll go back to benefits and know that actually I can't work then. It's not because I don't want to, but because the system won't let me, or unless I get some big job that pays me an incredible amount of money that I'm able to sustain myself for 5+ years or whatever, I won't be able to take on work until the system changes or something changes. So there was that leap that I had to take when I informed them that I no longer needed benefits anymore. And I can't, again,
and it's scary. It's scary when you did that. It's because I made the same decision.
Absolutely frightening.
It's terrifying.
Because I was like,
are you sure it took so much to qualify?
Yeah, Yeah, if this fucks up, I'm screwed. Um, absolutely.
And there's
yeah,
no
which is
guarantee
terrifying.
that the bureaucracies you'd have to navigate to get it all back, that it'll be as that you'll
Yes,
get it, right, and
exactly.
that you'll
Yes.
get the
Yeah.
support you need. So it's
Yeah.
terrifying. And
Exactly.
in that sense, the systems are set up in a sense to enforce you to be unproductive, like to not
Yeah.
take part, right?
Exactly. It is far less stress if you just don't earn. And I was like, but that's just not possible. Like, I see my siblings earning, working, going on holidays because they're entitled to annual leave, all that stuff. Okay, I can't work in those structures. There is not a job, or at least for me at the time, it didn't feel like there was the type of work structures that I could work in. There wasn't a job that would be that flexible, that understanding of me not showing up one day or rocking up at 1 p.m. instead of the morning or whatever, to be able to work and earn and thrive, not just survive and exist, but to actually thrive. And I wanted to thrive the same way my siblings did. And in a way, like that's for a long time, in both unhelpful and maybe some useful ways, I often used to compare what my siblings have, do, or where they go, that I should also be able to partake. We are the same, we are blood at the end of the day. I should not have to be excluded from things they are doing. Okay, admittedly I can't do it exactly the way that they do, but there should be another way for me to partake. And that's kind of like maybe a bit of my mum's pushiness that I'd internalized, that push aspect of like, I have to keep up because whatever they're doing, I should be able to do. Whatever they can access, I should be able to access. Yes, it's not going to be identical to the way that they do it, but I should still have the same rights as they do. Am I not one of them? Am I a different sibling?
This reminds me of going back to the chore thing, is that you're still doing the same thing in a different way, but you are all in community together having access to the same things.
Exactly.
I guess, yeah.
And so sometimes that was helpful in also pushing myself and also pushing past some of that internalized ableism, as to not write myself off. Because I think I did that a lot, where I'd just be like, it's cool, I'll sit this one out. Yeah, it's cool, I won't go. Yeah, it's cool, I won't kick up a fuss. Yeah, it's cool. And actually, it's not always cool. Sometimes I do have to kick up a fuss. Sometimes I do have to say this is unacceptable. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't have the energy to, but someone else will step in for me and say this can't run.
What I think about Matilda is just that force that she was brought up with to participate and to be a member of her intimate family community, but then that drove her out into the community itself. And I think what we've heard and what we'll hear in the next episode is how important stories are about how she is a writer. It's important that her voice, whether she's even talking about disability or not, how that's an important voice to be there, and that that the story she's telling, even in these two episodes, is also very important, and one that we don't usually hear about, and I think can not only be useful to people with disabilities, but people who are in the world, to understand how, when you're faced with different issues or different traits or different sort of contextual difficulties or arrangements, that there are ways for you to problem solve around those and go ahead.
Yeah, and Matilda's very clear about how her own life story intersected with different government programs, NGOs, organizations, and how the wider, political, economic, social context impacted their experience of disability, and what they think we need to be doing as a society to better include and support people with disabilities, or what we as a society need to be doing to better include disabled people.
Well, I trust you as a historian to make the political science point, but you're absolutely right. I think her discussion does show how much she is influenced by whether there's a government program in existence or it isn't in existence, or there's a granting agency, and whether that facilitates her making this leap into wanting to earn a salary. And she also talks, I think, quite clearly, as do many people we've talked to across the world, about how much programs for people with disabilities discourage them from going out and being productive and trying to draw a salary that they're punitive. So she's very articulate about, you're right, about how government intersects with her experience and her success or failure. Right.
Yeah. So tune in next time for part 2 of Matilda's story, as they talk about their views on disability and society at large.
Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Broadcastability. You can find us on the web at broadcastability.ca and theproudproject.ca. You can also find us on social media at The Proud Project on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, and we're The Proud Project CA on Instagram.
We would like to acknowledge the University of Toronto Scarborough and our community partners, Indie 88, Disability Rights UK, and SWORD, Social Research with Deaf People, at the University of Manchester, for supporting the production of these podcasts. We would also like to thank our granting agencies, the Canada Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and TechNation for helping us create Season 2 of Broadcastability. Broadcastability is produced by the Proud Project at Scarborough College at the University of Toronto in partnership with Indie 88, Disability Rights UK, and SORD, Social Research with Deaf People. Season 2 of Broadcastability is hosted by Dr. Chloë Atkins and Isabelle Avakumovic-Pointon. The music in this podcast was composed and produced by Justin Laurie.